Today we're talking all about knob and tube wiring. Welcome back, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me again. It is an absolute pleasure to have you tuning in. Today's topic is super exciting because I actually deal with it quite a bit selling houses in Hamilton, Ontario, and I feel like unless you are, you've either owned a home that had knob and tube wiring or you are involved in a lot of real estate, you probably don't really know what it is. So I want to help draw some attention to it and why you should care. But before that, if you're looking to buy or sell a house in Hamilton, Ontario, be sure to use the link in the description below. There you'll be able to book an appointment with me at a time that's convenient for you. Let's dive into this topic. So what is knob and tube wiring? Knob and tube wiring is a type of wiring that was used up until the 1950s in North America. So if you live in Hamilton, Lower Hamilton, downtown, you have an older home, one of those 2.5 stories particularly, a lot of those will have knob and tube wiring in them or would have at some point. What is knob and tube wiring? Essentially, the way it got its name is it's a system of knobs and tubes and wiring. So the one way to tell is if you have these white porcelain little tubes that run through the floor joist. So if you have an unfinished basement, you'll be able to see it easily. They go through the floor joist so they can feed the wire through the joist. Then they hook over these white porcelain knobs to continue running the wire along the joist. So that's how it came up with its name, knob and tube wiring. As well, the wiring is often covered in a black rubber fabric type material. So that's essentially what it is. One of the main differences between knob and tube and more modern wiring, such as copper or even aluminum, is knob and tube wiring is not grounded. So one way right off the bat to tell if you have it is if you look at your outlets and you don't have those 3 prongs, you only have 2 prongs, and your house is built before 1950, chances are you have knob and tube wiring running to that outlet. As well, knob and tube wiring generally runs off of 60 amp service and not 100 amp service. I'm going to get into some of the problems with it and some of the things to look for when you're buying and selling a home, because sometimes knob and tube does not always make itself ready for everybody to see. It's not readily visible, but there's certain ways, certain things you can look at to tell. So what is the problem with knob and tube wiring and why should you care about it? So one of the biggest issues with knob and tube wiring is it has a tendency to overheat. It's not grounded. So especially if it's running through the house, it's covered with insulation, or in the attic with insulation on top, the wiring can overheat and it can cause fires. Now, I'm not saying your house is going to catch fire if you have it, but this just is one of the biggest reasons that knob and tube wiring is such a large issue in Ontario, to the point that it can actually affect your ability to get insurance, which we're going to jump into right after this. As well, knob and tube wiring, one problem is it can be exposed to excessive use. So what I mean by that is when these homes were built pre-1950s, they weren't running all these appliances, air fryers, fridges, blenders, whatever you're plugging in. They weren't meant to run these things like these big washers and dryers. So one thing that can happen is the wiring can be overloaded and as well can cause issues with the wiring. Number 3, one of the things that is a big issue is if there's been alterations made to it. Now, it's not uncommon in Hamilton to see a brand new panel in the basement with what looks like new wiring running up into the walls, but sometimes it's connected to knob and tube wiring that still exists in the wall, but is not visible to the naked eye. So this is a problem and an issue when you're looking at homes in Hamilton. You really have to be careful because if it hasn't been maintained correctly or switched over correctly, then it could be a very, very big safety hazard. Number 4 is easily, not easily damaged, but if it is damaged over time, it can be a hazard. So if the rubberized casing has broken away, has become brittle, has become deteriorated, or it's become damaged along the way, you could have exposed wiring in the house. And if it's touching certain things, it's a fire waiting to happen. So this is why insurance companies are not crazy about it. In fact, some insurance companies won't even insure knob and tube. However, some will, but you have to expect that you're going to pay a premium in order to insure your house if it has knob and tube wiring. One thing that I always say when I'm showing houses, and I don't know if I'm repeating myself here, but is if the house was pre-1950 and even if we see remnants of old knob and tube, but it looks like it's been disconnected, I always think that it's not terrible to assume that there's probably still knob and tube existing in the wall, because the only way to replace it is to replace the entire wiring in the house. And unfortunately, over the years, people have gone about, done renovations, and haven't probably haven't changed it over unless they've absolutely had to, especially if you're in a larger 2.5 story home, because it's a lot trickier to get to those wires to change them, which means if you have to change it, that brings us forward to cost. So it really depends on the size of the home, the square footage. I've seen quotes for knob and tube wiring of up to $25,000 in a 2.5 story older Victorian home to replace all that wiring. However, you have to keep in mind certain things when you're replacing wiring, especially in these older homes. A lot of these homes have a plaster wall instead of drywall. So one major issue is if you're poking holes in plaster, I don't know if you've ever done it, it turns basically into dust. And to patch plaster is an absolute nightmare unless you're like a 95-year-old Italian man that's been doing it all your life. It can be an absolute problem. So you have to keep in mind the cost of patching those holes, or possibly even having to drywall the room again to fix those patches just to get that clean finished look. So there is a lot that goes into replacing knob and tube. It's not exciting. However, it is something when we're talking about selling a property that you have to take into consideration. Now, knob and tube is something that should be disclosed on the sale of a property to the purchaser, and they should be aware of it prior to closing, especially if you have a home inspection. This is something a home inspector should be picking up on, is that it, visible knob and tube. However, they can't see through walls, so you're not 100% going to catch it every time. But when it comes to buying and selling a house, it's definitely something we have to consider. Now, if you have knob and tube in your property, one thing I'd recommend is let's get a quote. Let's figure out how much it's going to cost from an electrician, so we have that readily available. And then I recommend you don't price the property. I'm going to give you a trade secret here. Don't price the property below what it's worth because you have knob and tube. I would price it with what it's worth without knob and tube. And when somebody else comes in, we disclose it, then we can negotiate it. Because if you price it low based on knob and tube, when somebody comes in and sees it, they're going to want to negotiate it down even more. So you don't want to double discount yourself. Just be careful there. As well, we have to realize that, as a seller, oftentimes, it's up to you if you want to replace it. I think if you're selling a house with it, I wouldn't preemptively replace the wiring. Like I said, I would just go about, get the quote, and do it that way. If you're buying a house and it does become an issue on a home inspection, it is an absolute, it is an understandable reason to want to walk away from a house. Because your options pretty much at that point are asking the home seller to fix it, or you're asking for money off the price. Both of those things aren't the greatest scenarios, because if you're asking the seller to do the knob and tube, you have no control over the workmanship of the job. Even though we would like to assume that sellers are all going to do things properly, you don't have any control over the work that's going to be done. And then number two is, if you take the money off of the price, okay, that's great. You knocked a little bit of money off price, but all you really did was knock your mortgage payment down. You didn't really bring the, your deposit down that much. So it's not like by taking $25,000 off the price, you're going to have a bonus $25,000 to replace the wiring. You still have to come up with that cash after the fact. So this can be quite costly as well. If you run into the situation where you purchase the house and you have to then go get insurance, you're going to have a trickier time getting insurance. And then when you finally get insurance, it is going to be at a premium. Unless there's an insurance broker looking, watching this video and, some way to not make it a premium, reach out to me, please, anytime. But I hope that covers any questions you may have about knob and tube wiring. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'd love to answer them. I'm trying to do as many videos as possible on things that we see commonly in Hamilton. That way you're aware and have the knowledge that I have when we're looking for houses, whether we're buying or selling. Anyways, thank you so much again for joining me this week. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I can't wait to talk to you again next week.